We're going to focus on the specific forms that ethical egoism can take, right? So we talked a lot last week, or on Monday, sorry, about the kind of the difference between ethical egoism and um, psychological egoism, and how those things differ, and how tribal egoism kind of plays in the middle of that. Right now, we're for the next hour or so, we're going to talk a little bit more about how that egoism kind of becomes a system. And then we're going to talk again. So we talked a little bit about points of failure yesterday, or on Monday. Ooh, I'm having a hard time with that. On Monday, we talked about how it's distant, and how it's doesn't take into consideration things outside of your tribal group, and those kinds of things. Today, we'll focus more on how the systems themselves lead to that. We'll also talk a little bit about how egoism is teleological, why it is end-focused as opposed to being something that is more duty-based, right? I'm actually going to start there. We're going to start a little, talking a little bit about what we mean when we talk about teleological versus deontological. When we're talking about ontologies, and that's a really fancy word in philosophy for how things work. It's a rough approximation, right? When we're talking about ontologies, we use ontologies as capitalists, right? We often use those ontologies to categorize things in ways that show their dichotomies, how they directly differ. Teleological and deontological concepts are polar opposites, right? They're practically extremes. But within those two categories, you have a lot of movement, right? So you have things that can be more or less teleological. You have things where there's hints of the other kind of peppered in there. Egoism is one of those kinds of theories. It's a theory where there is a kind of duty going on, a kind of intention that sort of sits in the background, even though what we're focused on is the end result, our individual good, right? So a teleological system then is a system that focuses on the end results, right? Now, for some of those, that's the only focus, right? We'll start talking about those next week. The only focus is the end result. And then for some, we're very close to the center, right? We're very close to that tipping point where the end result is only a very small part of the story, right? Or at least 51% of the story, right? The intention behind things, the motivation behind things, maybe in the 49th percentile, right? How we might think about this is if you imagine something like playing a sport or playing a game, right? Think of why you play the game. If you play the game because you are looking forward to spending time with your friends and you think it's really enjoyable, maybe there's something about the game that helps sharpen your wit, or otherwise provides you some kind of benefit. If those are the reasons that you play the game, then that's a teleological reason, right? It's a reason towards some end, some result that you want. If you play the game because you promised your friends that you would meet them on Wednesday at 6 p.m. to play some games, and that's the only reason you're playing the game, that's deontological, right? You're only playing the game because you made the promise. because there is an obligation on you to play, right? That's deontological. So as you can imagine, it is very difficult to look at the world from one or another of those perspectives solely, right? So for the same reason, there's very few systems, very few ethical systems that sit very firmly in one or the other, right? So we're looking mostly at, when we're talking about these categories, we're looking mostly at how deeply they fit. You know, how much of the system is focused on one side or the other, right? So egoism, in all of its forms, is always focused more on end results than it is on duties. But there is this underlying duty, right? Now, go into my caveat again. Probably do this at least a couple times a week. There's always a deontological core going on with every system, right? What's our deontological core? What is that one underlying principle that has to be present for an ethical system to work? What do we think?
Are you talking about how the goal has to be to seek the good, like to always do what's best? Like for the well-being. I couldn't think of the word.
Right. So Roselle kind of summed it up really nicely, right? Seeking the good, right? You have to want to be a good person. That has to be there. If you're just going through the motions, then it's not ethics, right? You're just following laws or you're just following rules. You may do that for a purpose or not, but you know, unless you want it, then it's not ethics. So that is a deontological concept. Even though it sounds like it's something that is based on an end result. I want to be a good person. My end result is to be a good person. It's not really what's going on, right? What's really going on is that you have this, the will, right? You have a good will, which we will talk about quite a bit more when we talk about deontology, what the good will is and how it interacts with ethics. Can you guys hear me okay? Looks like my mic is not registering very well.
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right.
Yeah, you're good. We can hear you.
Cool. But yeah, and so the goodwill, which is a little archaic in the way that it sounds, right? Oh, you have a goodwill. Just means the desire to be a good person, right? The inherent and kind of unwavering desire to be a good person. So all systems have this kind of underlying piece that is kind of deeply deontological. And it prevents things like, say, without knowing more, without being able to understand more about how, say, a dog thinks or a dolphin thinks or any other kind of non-human animal thinks, those creatures can never be ethical from the perspective of how human beings are ethical. Now, that's not to say that they're not from their own perspective. It's not to say that they can't be from even our perspective. We just don't have the capacity to understand it yet, right? We just don't have their language. Conversation for another time. We will actually talk a little bit about animal rights towards the end of the course. Well, actually, it's not that, but the later part of the course. But yeah, so that inherent goodwill is going to kind of sit as an underlying deontological concept throughout. That's kind of important because at even its most rigorous, certain consequentialist ethics will try to kind of almost get away from that because they're trying to hit that extreme. And you find after looking at the systems, going through and really thinking about what's going on, you simply can't separate the two things away. And it's just proof. It's proof that you cannot take one without the other. That the two sort of need each other in a strong kind of way. But the two extremes get pretty close, right? Egoism is not one of them. Egoism is not one of those extremes, right? Egoism is very close to, you might consider it to be kind of 3/4 of the way along towards an extreme consequentialism, right? The majority of what you do in an egoist structure is trying to achieve your own good, right? Trying to seek what is best for yourself, with the understanding that you're doing so that nobody else has to, right? Because no one else can possibly know you're good. Capital G good. So within that, and so ethical egoism, as it's stated, right, using capital E's there, is a theory. It's its own theory. There's kind of a category of egoism that is ethical egoism as well, that's a little more broad and covers a little more ground. But there is a specific theory called ethical egoism. But there are other kinds of ethical egoism in which there is a kind of different points of view, different directions of travel that are slightly different. And they differ mostly in the way that they interact with this teleological, deontological mix, right? Ultimately, they still have that core conceit, right? That core conceit that my good is only knowable to me. Nobody else can know my good better than I can, right? And it's followed by a secondary conceit that if I'm achieving my good, I don't have to worry about you, you don't have to worry about me, right? So I'm freeing you up to achieve your own goods. Where they break down is how much we focus on that, right? How much do we focus on staying out of other people's way? At its most extreme, at the farthest end of egoism, we get what modern philosophers nowadays call objectivism. Now, objectivism in its original form was garbage. Now, most egoism isn't very good, but original objectivism was garbage. It was philosophical garbage. And what I mean by that is it was written, first off, it was written by someone who had just enough, just a smattering of philosophical training, enough to use some philosophical language, but did so in a way that didn't actually cohere, right? It didn't make sense. It wasn't logically sound. Now, unfortunately, because the VCCS system doesn't require you to take Philosophy 101 before taking an ethics course, logical structures aren't going to make a lot of sense to you. So I'm not going to go into that too much. You're just going to have to take me at my word. In order for a system to be coherent, in order for it to be even remotely valuable, and in any way something that you could try to implement into your life, it has to be logically valid. So original egoism is most famously known because of its author, Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand wrote her more famous novels are things like The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged and some of these others, right? But she also wrote a couple of what she thought were grand and sweeping philosophical works. One of them was just called Objectivism. And like I said, there's just not enough logical coherence for those to be at all useful. The system of thought, because it's not a system of ethics, there is no desire for being a good person in any of her books. But her system of thought in her books are also logically inconsistent, and it makes it difficult because a lot of people kind of elevate her as the author and the kind of the mother of these theories, when in part all she did was give it a name. But following her, there were enough trained philosophers, people who understood how logical consistency works, how system building works, who took tidbits of what it was that she was trying to say and created something logically coherent. The logically coherent doesn't mean good, right? It doesn't mean that it works. It just means that it's coherent. In that form of objectivism, in that philosophically valid form of objectivism, the egoism takes a focus on the personal good of the individual, right? That is the focus. The deontological aspects are scant. They're just barely there. So yeah, you're not trying to hurt people. You're even actively avoiding harm in any kind of direct way. But there's really no objective aspect within the system that maintains that you're not allowed to just trounce all over everybody else to get to your ends, right? As the theory stands, the concept is that we're all too much in conflict. There's too much contest within human interaction for us to ever achieve our good without every one of our actions in some way inhibiting somebody else's good. And of course, this is objectively false. We know this is false. We can act in other people's best interests while achieving our own interests, not only easily, but it's almost easier to do that than to not, right? Because empathy, right? In the same way that it's much easier to walk a straight line if you can see where you're walking to than it is to close your eyes and walk a straight line, right? So if we allow our empathy to help guide us when we're making ethical decisions under egoism, then we're a lot less likely to just trounce all over everybody, right? While still actively seeking our own good. So objectivism takes this kind of extreme point of view, but it's also the one that has the highest points of failure. It's unfortunately also the one that is most famous of the kinds of egoism that are out there. And to make it worse, it's not even the nice, logically coherent one that is the most famous, but Ayn Rand specifically, and it has been modified into a political system as well that we now call libertarianism, which also has a number of strong inconsistencies, because rather than taking the logically coherent version of objectivism and turning it into a political system, they took Rand's work and made it into a political system. So we have to understand that that exists, because it's the one we're going to run into the most, especially while you're doing your research for your bibliography this week. You're going to run into objectivism a lot when you're talking about egoism. All right. Then we have the other extreme, the kind of what you might call the almost useful egoism, that is called, that uses the proper noun, ethical egoism, right? Ethical egoism is that kind of, do I have Star Trek fans in here? If I have Star Trek fans in here, then it's the prime directive, right? Non-interference. I stay out of your way, stay out of my way, everybody's happy, right? I get to do my thing, you get to do your thing. As long as I'm not hurting anybody, I'm fine. It's kind of this ultimate freedom sort of thing. I seek my good, you seek your good, everybody's out there seeking their good, I'm not in your way. Happiness, right? Everybody chooses happiness. Now, we talked quite a bit about how that fails last week, so we don't have to really dig into that too much. Those points of failure are less obvious than the objectivism points of failure. Those are blatant. They just are right there in your face. Whereas ethical egoism can look really appealing. Like, you know what, I don't have to extend myself beyond my sphere of influence. That sounds really appealing. I can do that. I don't have to work hard. I can just go out there, be a good person, and do my thing, right? Sounds really appealing. And like I said, it's a great starting point. If you're just trying to figure out how to get from not caring about anybody to this kind of position, this place where you actually consider other people, where you actually consider the world in a way that you want it to be better, that you want people to be better off, then it's a good step. It's a nice step. The nice thing about egoism, and this is kind of where the middle fills in. Egoism doesn't come with its own moral bucket, right? You get to bring your own morals into ethical egoism. Now, in order to be coherent, of course, you have to kind of subject all of those morals to examination, right? Is this particular moral consistent with the rest of my morals? Let's have a look. Why? Why am I not allowed to go out in public naked? Is that an ethical thing, or is it just against the law? Because if it's just against the law, fine, I'll follow the law because it's the law. But is there an ethical reason why I shouldn't be able to run around naked? Take a look at that. You think about it, and you're like, maybe there's some good societal reasons, right? Maybe there's issues having to do with what aestheticians, those people who deal with the ethics of art or the philosophy of art, what we call form and function, right? So the human body is subjected to form and function judgment, just like most other things, right? We look at it from the perspective of certain levels of what we consider to be the ideal, then we judge ourselves based on those things, and that can be harmful, right? Especially if our body functions exactly as it's supposed to, even though it doesn't fit some of those ideals. And especially if some of those ideals are unachievable or are frivolous, unnecessary. So, there might be an ethical reason there. Okay, so we've got a little something to work with. What else? What else might cause us to think that running around in public naked might be problematic? Well, there's some good old-fashioned biological reasons, right? Things like exposure, those basic minor protections from the environment, right? Protection from damage and protection from other kinds of harm, right? There also might be reasons that are sort of built into our society, right? So we've lived in a society for so long that thinks that running around naked in public is wrong, that we're not able to disentangle the wrongness of running around naked from the fact that society thinks that it's wrong to run around naked. Not just that it's illegal, but that they think it's wrong. Okay, there's something to that, right? Societal norms are important, even if upon examination, some of those norms don't make a ton of sense, right, from that purely objective standpoint. But that means that you actually have work to do, right? When you're looking at egoism and realizing that you have to bring your own moral bucket to the party, you have to start examining things. Why? Why do I think this is wrong or right? Now, for the most part, this isn't a huge problem when you're acting, right? Because you can do those examinations as they come up. Why shouldn't I take this object that nobody is currently observing and no one would notice if I were to take it away, right? Is it really stealing if nobody knows that I stole it, right? That kind of thing. That kind of as you go. Where it becomes problematic is when you start judging others based upon your own moral grounds, right? So if you look at someone else and they do something that goes against one of those objects in your moral bucket, and your first inclination is to think that they're a bad person because of it, that's when you need to do that soul searching, right? Is this really as bad as I think it is? Why? Why do I think this is such a bad thing? Does it make sense that from another point of view, this would not be wrong, right? So there's kind of a lot of work to do with egoism. And it can make it almost exhausting, right? If you allow that to go on. But of course, the easiest way to get through all that is just not be judgmental at all. But we're humans. We can't do that. We don't have the capacity. The way that our cognitive bias works is through judgment of our environment, observing our environment, right? We need to build those pathways in order for our brain to function. So we're constantly judging everything, including people. So pretty disastrous, right? Pretty disastrous to get stuck in a situation where you want to call someone out for something that they're doing, or you want to correct an action, or you want to train, say, a child or someone who is ethically unaware, but you don't know. You don't know if what you're trying to teach them or what you're trying to call out is actually wrong, or right for that matter, right? You should go and do the thing. Why? Go make your bed. Why? Why should I make my bed? I've gone a pretty solid 40 years without really being one of those people that concerns themselves with making a bed. I don't care. I'm going to crawl back into it in a couple hours. To me, there's no reason to do those sorts of things unless I'm inviting people into my bedroom to show it off. Then I don't find anything aesthetically appealing about a made bed that is necessary, right? So for someone to say, come in and observe my home and notice that I don't make my bed, and say, why don't you make your bed? I'll flipping want to. That's why, right? And it's perfectly legitimate. For them to judge me for that would be false, right? That would be fallacious, a fallacy, right? So with egoism, we're stuck with those kinds of things. We're stuck with that work all the time, and that can be really troublesome. Now, this is true from one end of the spectrum of egoism to the other. No matter what kind of egoism you're talking about, whether it be that strong ethical egoism of non-interference versus that very consequential egoism of all costs, my good at all costs. You're still bringing your own moral bucket into the mix. How strongly, like basically how full is the bucket, right? And where did you get most of those concepts will shift you between those two extremes, right? So let's say that you had a very strong religious upbringing. Now, a lot of people think that if they've had a religious upbringing, that means that they're going to be ethical because they've got this massive moral bucket that they've acquired from their religion, right? So they've got all these morals that they were taught in their congregations, within their groups, their religious communities, and think, okay, I'm set. In fact, that's an egoism, right? It's a kind of egoism, because outside of everything that's covered by those individual things, you're going to default to your own good. And in fact, most people, if you were to go through an interview, most people who follow a religious edict of some kind do so out of either fear of punishment or desire for reward. And that's as egoist as it gets, right? If you follow your religion, and this is not a judgment, right? This is the system. This is how the system works. If you follow a religion because of a benefit to you, that's an egoist way of thinking, right? Plain and simple. If that's uncomfortable, you may want to examine that, right? If you're okay with that, then you're fine, right? Because it's an egoist point of view. That means it's a system. That's fine as long as you see it as a system and then realize that system's points of failure. But for those people who make claims of being ethical persons and don't follow a religion, for them to get charged with being evil or dangerous or something like that because they don't fear punishment is kind of odd, right? If you really think about that. Why is it that someone who chooses on their own to be a good person, why is that a lesser form of goodness than being a good person because you're afraid that if you don't, you're going to receive some kind of punishment? It's kind of the wrong way to think about things, right? It's not logically consistent. We like to think that our choices matter, and in most religions, in fact, all religions that I'm familiar with. Make sure I'm not speaking that one. Okay. With every religion that I'm familiar with, human beings have choice, right? We have choice. Why is choice not valuable? That's what's being said when that judgment is passed, is that someone's choice is not valuable. Instead, what is valuable is fear. Now, there are lots of other reasons to follow a religious ethic, right? So this is not a statement that religious ethics are wrong. It's simply a point of judgment that could be wrong if made based on these criteria, right? So if a religious person thinks that a non-religious person is a bad person because they do not have fear, then that's logically inconsistent. That person has not objectively looked at their beliefs. And this is especially true if you are only using that religious moral bucket, right? Because in every religion, even the newest ones, there are logical inconsistencies within the religion itself by their very nature. So you have to examine them, right? And for theorists who work in this field, that's really important. Like, you should be doing that. That's part of what the whole plan was. plan was that you're supposed to look at these things and make the decisions for yourself. Interesting from the perspective of theory, not very comfortable for people who don't want to have to think about it. And that's where a lot of times we see pushback on these kinds of ideas. If you tell someone, hey, you got to think about your ethics, but just tell me what you want me to do. That's all I want. Just tell me what you want me to do. I'll do it. I don't want to have to think about it. Okay, well then do this. Here's this book, right? And here's a little dose of fear to go with it, just to make sure you stay on track. Cool, done. Oh, but wait, you still have to think about that stuff because there's a lot of things in that book that go against each other. Crap, I'm right back where I started. So it can be a little uncomfortable, but it's worth it, right? It's as I said, within the theory, or with from the perspective of certain theorists within both theology and philosophy of religion, that's the point. The point is that you're still supposed to think about it. Those inconsistencies were done on purpose, for a purpose or on purpose. Okay, so it's important to take that consideration, or take that into consideration, that a lot of times religious ethics isn't ethics. Religious ethics is a moral bucket. You still have to provide the system, right? Now we find that religious ethics fits best in a deontological model. The egoist model is the kind of the easy but incorrect model, the worst fit, or at least not the best fit. A deontological model works much better, right? And we'll talk about that in a few weeks, how the divine command theory fits within a deontological model. Okay. All right. So good. I want to leave some time open for some questions, but that's really it. Egoism has its points of failure. We've talked about that, right? It's myopic. It's only focused on a single sphere of influence. It's tribal in nature. It's difficult to adjudicate judgment within an egoist model. It can very easily lead, if you go to the extreme, it can lead to losing focus on do no harm, right? On being a good person. Lots of points of failure. Lots of places where it's not a good system forever, but not useless. And it is the stepping stone, right? It's a good one for kids. You start kids down the path of ethical egoism very early, instead of trying to immediately boost them into another way of thinking. They're much more likely to ramp up. It's an easier transition, right? So it's kind of the crawl, walk, run thing. So the egoism is that walk stage, but it's kind of a ponderous walk. You don't get very far. So I'll hang out for a little while for questions, but otherwise, nice early quick day today, which was supposed to be last week. This week was supposed to be the long one, but worked out. Questions? Comments? Challenges? I like challenges. Have a good one. Oh, everybody do a quick comment in the chat so that I can do send it. Just hi, bye, whatever.
Thank